Welcome to Human Trafficking 101. This course is intended for victim service providers to develop a foundational understanding of trafficking. During this training, we will review the statutory definition of human trafficking, common victim vulnerabilities, and tools of exploitation. This brief overview is primarily focused on identifying trafficking cases and defining the role of victim service providers in caring for survivors. Throughout this training, we will use the term victim to refer to an individual who is being exploited. This term is commonly used by courts and law enforcement to draw attention to the behavior of the perpetrator against the victim. We will refer to individuals in need of assistance or engaging in self-advocacy as survivors. This term emphasizes the autonomy, power, and self-determination of an individual who has been through a traumatic event. Human trafficking is the trade in people. Human trafficking is defined in South Carolina statute and in federal law as when a person is induced to perform labor or a commercial sex act through force, fraud, or coercion, or when an attempt is made to subject someone to these conditions. Labor trafficking involves the exploitation of a person's physical or intellectual work for which the person performing the work is not compensated fairly. Sex trafficking involves commercial sex acts that are obtained through an illegal means with the purpose of exploiting the individual. It is important to distinguish sex trafficking from other forms of sex work that someone may engage in voluntarily. Some forms of sex work, such as dancing or pornography, may be legal if the person is an adult and consents to the activity. No two cases of human trafficking are identical, and many crimes involve both labor and sexual exploitation. In addition, survivors may have experienced sexual and/or intimate partner violence while they were being trafficked. State and federal anti-human trafficking laws outline three elements of human trafficking. These are the act, or the behavior of the trafficker toward the victim, the means, or the way in which the trafficker manipulated the victim into an exploitive situation, and the purpose, or the motivation behind the trafficker's behavior. In cases involving adult victims, prosecution must provide evidence of all three elements in order to get a human trafficking conviction. Because minors cannot consent to sexual activity, all commercial sex involving a person under the age of 18 is legally defined as human trafficking. These cases are exempt from the means requirement. Anyone can be targeted as a victim of human trafficking. However, interpersonal violence is a part of systemic and structural oppression. As a result, some individuals may be more vulnerable to these types of abuse. A few examples include runaway and homeless youth, chronically poor or homeless adults, people fleeing war or conflict, people facing social discrimination, foreign nationals who have paid significant recruitment and travel fees, people with limited English proficiency, and victims of prior intimate partner violence and sexual assault. Next, we will explore in more detail what each of these three elements of human trafficking law look like using a few case studies. This is Nicole. Nicole was in and out of foster care as a child. When she aged out of the system, her father was living in a shelter, and Nicole knew she'd have to take care of herself. She spent a few days on friends' couches before a girl she knew from the group home offered her to be a roommate. Right away, Marie helped Nicole buy new clothes and get a job as a waitress. Marie was funny and encouraging, and the two became as close as sisters. Nicole was making great tips at the restaurant, but couldn't quite pay her share of the bills. Marie somehow always had money to spend. At a party one night, Marie introduced Nicole to Frank. Marie explained that Frank helped her make extra money. He was charming. He showered Nicole with gifts and flowers, lots of attention, and took her out to the nicest restaurants. At first, Frank set Nicole up on dates once or twice a week. She kept most of the money, and he still treated her to a nice dinner occasionally. But over time, he pressured Nicole to go out more often and kept more of the money she received. The men she was meeting were aggressive and sometimes hit Nicole, forced her to take drugs, or do things sexually she wasn't comfortable with. Eventually, Frank was taking all of the money from her each night, saying he would be sure her bills were paid. She lost her waitressing job because she was often out late and couldn't seem to get out of bed in the afternoon. Frank stopped giving Nicole gifts. One night, Nicole said she wanted to stop going out, and she would find a less expensive apartment she could afford with a waitressing job. She refused to turn over the $800 that she'd earned that night. Frank became violent, beating her with a broom and a belt, and repeatedly sexually assaulting her for several hours. The first element of human trafficking is the act. Trafficking can be charged against people who have participated in the exploitation at any stage. In Nicole's case, it may be obvious that Frank is abusing Nicole, but it's less commonly known that Marie could also be charged, since she knew that introducing Nicole to Frank would lead to her exploitation. Additionally, the men who buy sex with the trafficked person, those who went on dates with Nicole, could also be tried and convicted in some circumstances. Nicole's story also clarifies a common misconception. Trafficking, unlike smuggling, does not necessarily involve the movement of a person from one location to another. Nicole has lived in the same city her whole life. Nevertheless, she's been manipulated into an exploitive situation. She is the victim of a human rights violation. Human smuggling is a crime against a sovereign nation where someone facilitates or attempts to facilitate a person's movement across an international border by illegal means. Generally, the person being moved across the border is cooperating and may even have solicited the assistance from the smuggler. Unlike trafficking victims, people who have been smuggled across the border are free to move, change jobs, and associate freely without interference by the person who helped them cross the border. It is possible for a case of human smuggling to become a case of human trafficking if the traveling individual must work off a debt or is held against their will by the smuggler. But the crime of human trafficking, which is a human rights violation against an individual, can be charged even if there was no transportation involved in the exploitation. This is Luis. He grew up in El Salvador. His family was poor, and many of the young men in his community joined gangs and became addicted to drugs. When he heard there was an American businessman in a nearby city looking for workers, he jumped at the opportunity. The man promised to get him a work visa for the U.S. and said the company would arrange hotel rooms as the crew traveled between work sites. He would earn $12 an hour, meaning he could earn more in one day than he could in 2 weeks in El Salvador. He was proud that he'd be able to send so much money home to help his parents. The company did help Luis get his passport and then a work visa to enter the U.S. Luis was relieved that most of the other men he worked with were Hispanic because he didn't know any English. On his first day, a woman asked him to sign a lot of documents that he couldn't read, saying they were required for his visa. She offered to keep his passport locked in the office because they'd had problems with some theft in some of the hotels. Luis felt grateful. That passport was the only valuable thing he owned. Luis worked hard and was exhausted each day, but he was excited to be learning new skills. A food truck came by in the parking lot every afternoon, and Luis learned he was allowed one sandwich and a Coke. Each Friday, the crew leader handed out cash in envelopes. Luis was furious when his first envelope had only $10 in it. You have to pay back your passport, your visa, and your plane ticket before you can really start earning, the crew leader said. The boss just wanted you to have cash for little stuff you might need. Later, it was his work boots that needed replacing. After 6 months, someone explained that the hotel rooms and the sandwiches weren't actually free. Luis threatened to quit. He knew there must be another company that would need his skills and wouldn't treat him so poorly. The woman in the office told him that if he left, he would lose his visa, become illegal, and be deported. Luis said he would take that chance. He asked for his passport. "I don't know what you mean," she said. "You're responsible for your own documents." Luis, of course, knew she was lying. Many times when we think of trafficking, we imagine physical abuse, kidnappers, or locked basement. Luis's story illustrates that the means element can be less obvious. The means element of a human trafficking statute can take the form of force, fraud, or coercion. Luis entered an employment contract under a legal immigration process, but businesses who do not pay their employees according to law and contract are committing fraud. The company that hired Luis made false promises in respect to his wages. Luis is also in debt bondage, since he is responsible for repaying the expenses of his arrival, but it is unclear which expenses he's being held responsible for. Additionally, this company has used many tools of coercion to keep Luis working for them. The woman in the office has limited Luis's mobility by confiscating his passport. Although it is entirely true that Luis's work visa would be invalidated by his quitting this job, it is illegal for the company to threaten and manipulate him into staying in an abusive work environment due to his immigration status. These threats regarding deportation create a climate of fear. By falsifying the representation of Luis's working conditions in applying for his work visa, the company has abused the legal system. Luis's case highlights the push-pull factors that are often involved in international trafficking cases. Push factors are those circumstances in a person's home country, such as poverty, political instability, ethnic conflict, and gender-based violence, that create the desire to emigrate. Pull factors are belief about the destination country, such as the image of the promised land, educational and economic opportunity, and positive media portrayals. These reinforce the desire to immigrate. Global economics also create pull factors in much of Europe and the US, since those economies demand for cheap goods require cheap labor in order to persist. These push-pull factors are common vulnerabilities in trafficking cases where the victim is not a US citizen. This is Hannah. While in college, Hannah met Nelson, who was brilliant, warm, and charming. Nelson paid attention to Hannah in a way no one had before, and before long they were spending hours together every day. Hannah was depressed, and against her parents' advice, she was considering dropping out of school. Hannah openly worried about how she would make ends meet without her student loans and internship. So when Nelson proposed, Hannah felt everything in her life falling into place. They had a small wedding and reception at the church Hannah had attended since she was a child. Hannah started helping in the property management company Nelson's parents owned, doing minor repairs and cleaning properties between tenants. Nelson's mother explained that to make the bookkeeping easier, she would include Hannah's wages in Nelson's payroll checks. Hannah didn't mind. They were family, after all. Nelson took care of the household expenses anyway, and never hesitated to give her money if she needed clothes or gas, or to pick up her prescriptions from the pharmacy. Nelson worked long hours in the office, so Hannah did most of her own housework as well. But just a few months after the wedding, Hannah was annoyed by Nelson's badgering about how the apartment was dirty. Nothing ever seemed up to his standards. Nelson, on the other hand, often called Hannah selfish and ungrateful. "I've given you so much," Nelson told Hannah. "You'd be nothing without me." Nelson rarely wanted to go out anymore and grumbled when Hannah wanted to go out with her friends. Eventually, he forbade Hannah from leaving the house without him. He kept her purse and phone locked in the office while she was at work and made her leave the phone unlocked and on the counter when they were at home. She was only allowed to call her parents once a week, and her allowance started to diminish each pay period. Hannah felt Nelson only paid attention to her when he wanted to have sex. If Hannah wasn't interested, Nelson would insult Hannah, calling her stupid and ugly. He said it was her duty as a wife to satisfy him. Hannah wanted to make Nelson happy, so she usually gave in. After they'd been married about a year, Hannah found out that Nelson had been taking videos of them in the bedroom to post on the internet. She refused to have sex with him again unless he threw the video camera away. Nelson flushed a month's worth of her antidepressants down the toilet. Our first two examples may seem straightforward because there was clear financial benefit to the traffickers. But what about Hannah? Household chores are often part of the informal economy, even when businesses depend on this work. Financial exchange for labor or sex is not the only acceptable purpose under the human trafficking statute. Nelson and his family benefit from Hannah's work, and their intentional exploitation of her can be charged as human trafficking. Other examples of trafficking where the financial benefit to the trafficker is unclear might include a parent who trades sexual contact with their minor child for rent, food, or clothing, or restaurant owners who coerce their staff into erratic working hours with little time to sleep, eat, or drink. Hannah's case shows why it's so crucial for intimate partner violence and sexual assault providers to be invested in a human trafficking response system. Intimate partner violence, sexual assault, and human trafficking are three forms of interpersonal violence that often overlap. Some victims are exposed to seasoning as the exploitive relationship begins. Seasoning is the process of breaking down a victim's resistance by using physical violence, rape, and/or confinement to establish psychological, physical, and emotional control. Like Hannah, these victims may not ultimately be trafficked into industries that directly involve sex work, but have experienced sexual trauma, and perhaps intimate partner violence. In Hannah's case, she was financially and emotionally abused, socially isolated, coerced into non-consensual sex, and denied her rightful wages through force, fraud, and coercion. She is a victim of all three crimes. Victims being trafficked by their intimate partner may not be easily identified by law enforcement if the abuse is centralized within the household or family. A person like Hannah might come forward as a survivor of intimate partner violence at first, perhaps seeking shelter or support through divorce or custody issues. When compared to domestic work, it's more common for victims in sex work industries to be detected by law enforcement through an arrest or a raid. However, a person like Nicole might first be identified as a victim in an emergency room following a sexual or physical assault. Increasingly, providers in non-emergency health clinics are developing tools and skill sets that allow them to identify victims during preventative care appointments, such as contraceptive consultations. Through careful, trauma-informed evaluation of the case, victim advocates may be able to identify trafficking elements that make intimate partner and sexual violence survivors eligible for additional protections, services, and funding. It is important to keep in mind that survivors might seek services for one incident of abuse or assault, while considering sexual contact with someone we look at as a trafficker as consensual. A victim-centered, trauma-informed service provider will not force a survivor to address apparent trauma, unless that trauma is also a priority of the survivor. Trafficking survivors each have their own trauma and support needs, which can be quite complex. Our members can play a supportive role by providing care, as requested by the victim, consistent with their own expertise. Survivors may need crisis counseling or emotional support, advocacy, and accompaniment through healthcare and public benefit systems, and/or education about their rights regarding immigration. These services can and should be appropriately provided within our network and by our community partners. Housing human trafficking survivors can be challenging. In many areas, domestic violence shelters may have been the only option available to crime victims in recent years. However, trafficking victims might be identified by law enforcement through arrests and raids, and they are often referred for services before they identify themselves as victims. Community living models are not always appropriate for involuntary placement, particularly where location confidentiality is a priority. Meanwhile, trafficking victims that are able to refer themselves into services often have greater access to housing alternatives. Shelter providers should lend their expertise to community collaborative efforts to build trauma-informed, victim-centered housing options for individuals undergoing crisis. It is also important to note that trafficking survivors often face more pressure to collaborate with law enforcement as compared to sexual assault and intimate partner violence survivors. Providers should take care to keep boundaries and professional roles clear in trafficking cases, and ensure that survivors know they do not have to collaborate with law enforcement to be eligible for our services. If law enforcement pursues collaboration with the service provider, the relevant confidentiality statutes should be observed at all times. Why don't trafficking victims just leave? Shirley Julich writes that an isolated and threatened victim will look to protection from the abuser. The need for protection, combined with the will to survive, drives victims to actively search for expressions of kindness, empathy, or affection by the abuser. The victim suppresses any feelings of danger, terror, or rage, and through this denial is able to bond to the positive side of the abuse. So that they can survive, the victim becomes both hypervigilant and hypersensitive to the abuser's needs, feelings, and perspectives, suppressing their own needs. To effectively anticipate the needs of the abuser, the victim views the world through the perspective of the abuser, and this translates into positive feelings for the abuser. The harder victims must work to meet the needs of the abuser, the stronger their bond is to the abuser. Victims come to view any would-be rescuers, such as parents, police, therapists, or friends, as the bad guys, because that is the abuser's perspective. The abuser becomes the good guy, and victims eventually come to believe that they deserve the abuse or are somehow responsible. In short, traffickers often fulfill a need of the victim, whether that be financial, protective, or social. Staying with an abuser is most often a reflection of crucial survival instincts within that individual. This concludes the Human Trafficking 101 training. For additional information or further training on this topic, we welcome you to contact Skidvasa staff via email or phone. Thank you.